Hi guys, I am coming at you from my IB-PYP school here in China, where I am going to talk to you about special education needs, SEN policies here in China. First, we've got to look a little bit at the history. China actually has a really great history with acknowledging special education needs. The first time was about 2,000 years ago via Confucian texts, when they were suggesting that it was the responsibility of the community as a whole to take care of people with disabilities, just as they would take care of orphans or widows. The next time that we see really anything though regarding special education is in the 1870s and 1880s, when actually US and European missionaries started to open schools for blind and deaf students. Kind of in the 1900s, early 1900s, you start to see schools open up for teacher training of students with special education. So they were getting qualified teachers to become specialized in this area. By the mid-1900s, we have more schools opening to take in students with special education needs, and these were kept separate from the mainstream schools. They were their own small schools. But a lot of these schools ended up closing after World War II and not reopening. So you had a lack of schools in order to sufficiently support the special education community. Up until this point, there were no schools for students with mental retardation or other learning disabilities or other physical disabilities, and these were all schools for the blind or deaf. Let's look at the real laws going into place though that affected this. In 1986, we have the first law to affect special education needs, and that is the compulsory education law. It required local governments to set up these small separate schools for children with special needs. This idea was added to in 1990 when two more laws came into effect that required children with disabilities to have at least 9 years of education available to them. This law still stands. It is still 9 years of education here in China. This law, though, was not really encouraged or mandated, and we will see that as a continuous issue kind of throughout the current times as well. Starting in the 1980s and continuing until now, we also have an idea of inclusion, where students shouldn't be separated into their own classroom, but should be included in the general education programming and specially accommodated. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses to this. The first strength is going to be that there are laws in general. That's a great start. The weakness is going to be that they're really not properly mandated or reinforced. Keep in mind that with all these regulations, a lot of the students are being kept out of school still if they have special education needs because these laws are not enforced, and instead are institutionalized and kept away from society. The most recent law put into place is going to be in February 2017 when it called for more funding for special education programs, and it mandated all schools have individualized lesson plans and individualized plans for students with disabilities. Moving on, talking about how this might affect my school or might affect other schools in China. When I first brought this topic up to my principal, he was telling me that there are two major problems within schools dealing with SEN disabilities in general. So schools, first of all, are required to adapt and provide these SEN individualized programming, but many schools find loopholes and just don't admit these students at all. They just kind of throw up their hands and say, we don't want you. Although this is technically illegal, they do find these loopholes and still do it, especially private schools. Schools are also not properly equipped to deal with SEN students. They don't have the proper teachers, enough teachers, or departments dedicated to this, and there are not enough universities here currently specializing in training teachers on how to do this, as well as special education needs teachers here in China are not as highly regarded as general education teachers. The social aspect, this is a very big issue, especially when I was talking to my PYP director and my principal, saying that there is such a negative stigma associated with special needs and learning disabilities here that it really affects the learning and kind of the general outcome of special education needs programming. You might say there's a bad stigma in America or a bad stigma in Europe too, that it's not a good stigma, but because achieving high test scores is placed so highly, the importance of it is so high here in China, you have parents that will outright refuse to acknowledge their children have a problem, even when teachers are bringing it up to them, and also parents a lot of the times are lying to teachers and schools to get their students into these schools. So the schools have no idea that there might be a problem from the start. How does this specifically affect my school? We have roughly 1,000 students at my school, and only 2 of them currently are listed as having special education needs. This doesn't really sit right. I couldn't find any statistics on China, but roughly 13% of students in America are receiving special education programming in public schools. So something tells me that 13% in America versus 0.2% in China, something is not adding up, and the reporting is really one of the major problems in China, that these students with these needs aren't being reported and aren't being acknowledged. For example, in one of my classes, I right now have a student who, if I do not spend one-on-one time with him, the work does not get done. And I am forced to choose between working one-on-one with him with every activity or making sure the rest of my 29 students in that class are on task. I have no other help in that class, and it is just me with these 30 students. It makes it working with that one student very difficult, and a lot of the times he is getting left behind. Talking again a little bit with my PYP director and moving forward, and my principal as well, saying that what we really need in all schools is a qualified teacher with special needs background and specialization, as well as a psychologist to talk about, or to come in and assess these children individually, to be able to assess classrooms and assess the children one-on-one. You will also, in this case, be able to override the parent's lack of intervention or lack of consideration or willing to acknowledge it, because you can have a professional right there diagnosing these children. Also, the 9-year requirement of students in education is not enough. That we're seeing that maybe after year 9 of education, they can go on to vocational school training to train in things like farming or markets, like doing local markets a lot of times in rural areas. Things like this that will help them be more independent in their own communities. Food for thought. First of all, in China, in public classrooms, there are 50 to 70 students. How are we supposed to individualize lesson plans and plans in general, education plans for students with special needs, when there are 50 to 70 students for one teacher in a classroom? Number 2, what is better, to have students kind of essentially almost segregated into their own special education needs schools and have qualified teachers there working with them, where they have the chance of being kind of away from society, or to have them in schools that are general education schools that are ill-equipped to deal with them, don't have the proper education, resources, or teachers. My principal and my PYP director admitted that we have students here in our school with special education needs, and we do not have the proper, we are not properly equipped to deal with them, and we don't. So this is another huge issue here in China. So I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit of it, and I look forward to listening to everyone else's videos, but yeah, enjoy. Have a good one.